Hey film fans, what do you think about this?
Sylvia, you don't smoke.
You don't smoke?
No,
Why do you want to start now?
I'm scared to death, that's why. What, you don't smoke?
No.
How come?
I don't want the cancer.
Oh, my God. Give me the cigarette.
Go ahead, do what you want. I just think you ought to take care of your body, that's all.
My body? What for?
Your body is the temple of the Lord.
You're serious? So you rob a bank, but you keep your body pure. Is that it?
You gonna smoke the cigarette or what?
Yes. If I die of cancer, it'll be half your fault.
No, it's because you're weak.
Right. I'm weak.
Or this?
I'm sorry, I'm still in the bathroom.
They being the sheep, they will come out. Oh, yes, they'll come out. Oh, there'll be a brighter day tomorrow. They will come out. It's in the book.
What am I doing apologizing to you? Why am I always apologizing to you, you little bastard? 3 months I've been apologizing to you without you even being here. I haven't done anything wrong. Why can't I quit apologizing? You're the one ought to be sorry. I wouldn't still be in my bathrobe if it hadn't been for you. I had my clothes on hours ago. You're the one made me quit caring if I got dressed or not.
Or this?
And now I'm here to tell you that I have killed for my country or whatever. And I don't feel good about it. Because there's not enough reason, man. To feel a person die in your hands or to see your best buddy get blown away. I'm here to tell you, it's a lousy thing, man. I don't see any reason for it. And there's a lot of shit that I did over there that I find fucking hard to live with. And I don't want to see people like you, man, coming back and having to face the rest of your lives with that kind of shit. It's simple as that. I don't feel sorry for myself. I'm a lot fucking smarter now than when I went. And I'm just telling you, there's a choice to be made here.
Let's talk about performance on this episode of The Rise and Fall of New Hollywood. We all love acting. We love a great performance, a performance that pulls us into the film, a performance that conveys emotion, fear, stoicism, whatever it might be, to us in such a way that we feel like we can empathize with the characters. Even if they're villains, even if they're sidekicks, even if they're the also-ran love interest. If there's a great performance, even if it's just for a few minutes on screen, it draws us into the film and it creates an emotional or empathetic bond with the character that helps to immerse us in the movie. But how does that work? Once we start talking about what it is we love about a particular performance, it can be very difficult to articulate that. Was it just the way they delivered their dialogue? Was it their use of expressions, gestures, other kind of bigger actions, the way they walk, the way they fight, the way they fall, the way they kiss? And what about that performance? What makes one fight believable where another one seems stagey? What makes one tear-filled, emotional breakup tear at our hearts where the other one seems affected or even wooden? It's hard to explain, in part because acting styles, performance styles, have changed so much throughout Hollywood history, and they continue to change. And different generations look at performance with different expectations, with different eyes, with different feelings. Just look at, and this is a very kind of minor example, the way that different generations talk about Tobey Maguire versus Andrew Garfield versus Tom Holland playing Spider-Man and Peter Parker, and the kind of discourse around those three performances and which one's more believable, which one seems younger, is one a good Spider-Man but not a good Peter Parker, and vice versa. And you could do that with other characters that have been played by multiple actors, from James Bond to Batman, even to Don Vito Corleone. So these are kinds of good examples of how expectations around performance change. But performance itself has changed. And before we get into the dramatic impact that performance had on the success of New Hollywood, it's worth taking a minute or two just to think about a few of the significant historical changes that American acting, American Hollywood acting, underwent from the silent era to the 60s and into the 70s. To start, take a look at this. That's Lillian Gish in the 1919 film Broken Blossoms. And at the time, that was considered one of the preeminent major performances by an American actor that had ever been put on film, particularly that scene. When I show it to students sometimes today, they find it hard not to laugh, or at least find it uncomfortably hammy. And there are reasons for that. Like I said, acting styles have changed. In silent cinema, acting was, first of all, derived from the theater and vaudeville, and I'll talk about that in a second. But also, it was new. Acting for the camera was new. I mean, we're now talking 20 years, but it's new. And because there was no dialogue, the idea was that the performer had to project all of the emotion in the scene through their actions, acting, gestures, and expressions. So when you watch old silent films, there tends to be a kind of heightened performance. Lighting was different, cameras were different. So you get these kind of wide-eyed performances so that you could see the whites of actors' eyes better. And you get these kind of very deliberate gestures so that the emotion of them translate from a screen where there might be a piano player or there might be a full symphony adding kind of emotional music for impact, but all we get is what the actor's doing on the screen, not what they're saying, not any other sound effects besides what's happening with whatever music might be there. And so there was an understanding that acting had to be big. Part of the reason for that, as I said, is that a lot of early film actors came out of a theatrical or a vaudeville experience. Theatrical makes sense to you, you know what I'm talking about, Shakespeare or George Bernard Shaw or Oscar Wilde. You're performing on stage and you have to land an emotional punch that's just as hard to the people in the back rows or up in the balcony as it is to those in the front. And so there's projecting. There is an overemphasis on gesture, expression, and so on. Similar to the theatrical performance style was the vaudeville style. And vaudeville and theater have a lot in common, but they're different in a few key ways that I'll just mention. Vaudeville, like theater, was a live performance with an audience on a stage, whereas theater tended to be focused on dramatic pieces, including comedy, but feature length, what we would call feature length, a 2-hour play, the importance of being earnest, or Macbeth, or whatever it might be. Vaudeville was more kind of skit-based, kind of if you think about variety shows today, what you might see on television. I don't know if those things still exist, but so you'd have comedy, you'd have magic, you'd have acrobatics, you'd have some melodrama, but a scene rather than a full play. And they were intended to be exciting and to get the audience riled up. There was often an awareness of the audience. This is similar to the music hall tradition in the United Kingdom, which is not exactly the same, but there's a lot of crossover. That's the tradition that Charlie Chaplin came out of. And a lot of comic actors in early silent cinema came out of the vaudeville or the music hall tradition, and you get pratfalls and slapstick and a lot of physical comedy. Buster Keaton's a great example of that, who spent his youth in vaudeville and then translated that sort of physical comedy to the screen. Again, it was big physical action that was necessary because most of what we understood, I wasn't there, most of what viewers understood about the film's narrative and its emotional beats came from what they could see. And so to make that effective, what they could see had to be big. When sound came at the end of the 20s and really into the 30s, that changed everything because now actors could speak. And because of audio recording technology, which came along quickly but wasn't then what it is today, they didn't have to project so much, but they still had to enunciate. They're often recorded by one microphone, a boom microphone, and that microphone had to be able to pick up clearly what they said. So you got the development of a preponderance of Mid-Atlantic accents. Mid-Atlantic is a kind of a funny term, which means actually not like in an American sense, you know, Virginia or Maryland, but halfway across the Atlantic between American and British. And a great example of it is this.
How about you, Mr. Connor? You drink, don't you? Alcohol, I mean.
Oh, a little.
A little. And you a writer? I thought all writers drank to excess and beat their wives. You know, one time I think I secretly wanted to be a writer.
Or this.
Your intolerance infuriates me. I should think that of all people, a writer would need tolerance. The fact is, you can't be a first-rate writer or a first-rate human being until you've learned to have some small regard for human Aren't the geraniums pretty, Professor?
Cary Grant, who comes from Britain, Katharine Hepburn, who comes from America, both developed these kind of mid-Atlantic accents, and there's differences to them, but it's this sort of, well, hello, Charlie, what are you doing today? Well, I don't know, John, what do you think we should do? And it's got this sort of Britishisms in its articulation of certain sounds, but it's got Americanisms in terms of its kind of vowels and the way they would express their R's and things like that. Ask a linguist. And the reason for it, though, the reason for its success, and we see that in the 30s, we see this in the 40s, we see this in the 50s. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. It's American, but it's mid-Atlantic, right? Even people like Humphrey Bogart, who's not full-on Cary Grant mid-Atlantic, has that sort of articulation and enunciation of all the gin joints in all the world. She had to come into mine. Or why did she have to come into mine? I should have learned the line before I made the video. And that dominated acting in terms of dialogue and delivery, even as physical acting was starting to change. As camera technology and lighting technology improved throughout the 30s, and then when color came along and changed the way people looked on screen, actors and directors started to realize that delicate and subtle gestures and expressions could be picked up on camera, or on film really, in ways that they hadn't been able to in the 20s and the 30s. So even as delivery of dialogue remained kind of wedded to that old-fashioned theatrical style, performance did start to change a little bit. And you see this in film noir, you see this in westerns, where there's an ease of the body. John Wayne's famous walk. He's not sort of mannered in his, you know, the audience has to see exactly what I'm doing. He can be more laconic and more sort of natural in his action. But while these changes were slowly happening on screen in Hollywood film, something was happening in the New York theater that profoundly changed the way we think about acting, starting in the 50s, picking up steam in the 60s, and then kind of exploding across Hollywood screens in the 1970s. The method. Method acting is one of the sort of most misunderstood approaches to cinematic arts, I think, that are around today. And part of that's because it has a very long tradition. It's 100 years old. And part of that's because different teachers and different practitioners, performers, have changed what it means to them, taught it differently, and thereby changed what audiences think it means or what audiences expect from it. And it's a huge area of study. And if you're interested in method acting, there are a ton of resources online that go into more detail than I can do here. And I'll put a few links below. But just briefly, it was started by a Russian/Soviet theater actor and director named Konstantin Stanislavski in the early part of the 20th century. And to vastly oversimplify, Stanislavski was looking for ways to improve the authenticity of acting performance. Now, I say authenticity in scare quotes because authenticity is one of those words that also changes over time. An authentic experience is often whatever the culture of the time defines as authentic. So if you think about an authentic Italian restaurant, what that was in the 1950s is very different from what that was in the 1990s, which is very different from what that is today, authentic. And it's the same with performance. People watching Lillian Gish thought that was authentic. People watching Katharine Hepburn thought that was authentic. It can look mannered and fake to us today, but that doesn't mean at the time that it wasn't authentic. But anyhow, this is what Stanislavski was going for. And it occurred to him, well, I don't want to make too light of it. He studied this intensely and formulated ideas and worked on this for decades. It didn't just pop into his head one night. But it occurred to him that if actors are able to embody, to get in touch with, to access the thoughts and feelings that their character is conveying in a given scene, that the actor would be better able to convey those thoughts, those feelings, those actions to the audience. He developed this over a long time, and you can look at different phases of Stanislavski's method. Then you can look at the different actors he taught who then took it and put their own spin on it. But basically, there's kind of three areas: emotion, psychology, and action. And emotion is the one we hear about a lot when we hear about method acting. How does a performer access sadness? So you're an actor and you have to play a scene where you're sad. How do you do that? I mean, just turn this video off for a second or pause it and try to make yourself cry. It's hard. It's very hard. And we see that some actors are very good at it and some actors aren't quite good at it. Some actors are good at faking it. But how do you access that emotion? And again, to oversimplify, the idea was if you're performing a certain scene, let's say it's a breakup, try to remember, and not just remember, but embody the feeling that you had during a horrible breakup that you might have had earlier. Or if you haven't had a horrible breakup, some other ending of a relationship, or some other loss, or some other moment where something you cared about was taken away from you. You have to find the root to that emotion that you have experienced in the past so that you can re-experience it in the performance. And the training of Stanislavski, I don't mean rehearsal for a particular play, the training of the method is training the performer, training himself or herself to be able to access those moments more readily. So that as you train, it's not as hard to access a sad moment or a happy moment or an angry moment or a violent moment or whatever it might be. That's the emotional component. There's also the psychological component, which is trying to understand a character's thinking, trying to understand a character's motivation. This character's written this way, but if I, the performer, can better understand why the character would do that, then my portrayal of the character's decision to do that and follow through will be more believable or more authentic. And you find that method actors oftentimes will consult with psychologists or psychiatrists to try to understand their character better. The one that's kind of least talked about, except in one extreme way, is action. And the idea that our bodies have memories also. So if you've ever had deja vu, or if you've ever been in a situation where all of a sudden you recall a moment where you were doing something and that brings with it emotion, that's kind of it. That when we do things, when we go on a fair ride, when we hold our dad's hand when we're a little kid, when we climb a tree, when we fall out of a tree, when we get up the courage to walk across the room the first time as a kid and introduce ourselves to another kid. All of those things are actions. Our bodies are doing these things. And they bring with them emotions and memories that actors can also access or tap into. So the method was Stanislavski's efforts to train actors to use emotion, psychology, action, and other things to access an authentic experience that they could then use to convey their characters' emotions, thoughts, or actions in a believable way. In the 1920s and 30s, when Russia was undergoing the transition and then the implementation of the Soviet system, a lot of people left, as often happens when governments are overthrown and new regimes come in, and those new regimes decide that some things work for us and some things don't. And several of Stanislavski's students and colleagues emigrated to the United States. There's a lot of history around this. Again, I'll put a few links below. But some of them ended up in New York City, and they began giving lectures and workshops about the method to actors in New York. And in 1931, a bunch of actors and directors, including Lee Strasberg, Lee J. Cobb, Clifford Odets, Elia Kazan, and a lot more, formed the Group Theater in New York. And this was a Depression-era program that has also its own fascinating history. I'll put a link to that below too, where they wanted to put on a new kind of realism, or naturalism even. And they wanted to put on plays about working people. They wanted to put plays about the exploitation of the working class. They wanted to show what real life in America was like. And in their efforts to do this in terms of subject matter, they, like Stanislavski, were looking for performance style that could better convey the authenticity of those lived experiences of the sort of working class, the poor class, the labor class in the United States. And the group theater became immensely influential. Even though it didn't last an incredibly long time, many of its performers and many of its directors from the late 30s and into the 40s slowly made their way from New York to Los Angeles. And they brought with them these ideas about the method that they had learned through this group theater experience. Out of the group theater arose the Actors Studio, which some of you've probably heard of. And the Actors Studio was an acting school in New York City that aimed to teach the method. And several groundbreaking, influential teachers went through there, but three are particularly important: Lee Strasberg, Stella Adler, and Sanford Meisner. And when you're reading about some of your favorite actors from the mid-century up into the sort of 70s and 80s, you'll often hear them say something like, I studied at the Actors Studio, or I studied with Stella Adler. And these three were teachers of the method. They all had their own approach. And so this is where it starts to change, because Strasberg's and Meisner's and Adler's approach to the method were different. And some of them concentrated more on the emotional, some of them concentrated more on the psychological, some more on the behavioral or the acting. But they were teaching acting to a new generation of performers who came through in the 40s and into the 50s. People like Montgomery Clift, James Dean, and Marlon Brando. And all of these performers got their start in New York theater, but quickly made their way to Hollywood. And this is the first generation to bring method acting, what we call today method acting, to American screens. And it was electrifying at the time. If we watch Marlon Brando in A Streetcar Named Desire or On the Waterfront, there's an energy to that performance still today, even if there's some parts of it seem a little mannered to our kind of 2020 eyes or 2021 eyes. There's an electricity there that you don't see in previous generations of acting. And I love early acting from the 30s. I love acting from the 40s. I love Humphrey Bogart and so on. I'm not saying it's necessarily better. I'm just saying there's an energy to it. There's a authenticity to it in the sense that it's a new kind of believability. It's a new kind of experience to witness Brando on screen in those early films, to witness Montgomery Clift, to witness James Dean. And that was incredibly influential. Actors in the 50s who are coming up, who are in their teens or 20s, are watching Marlon Brando and thinking, I want to do that.
Go on, Blanche. No, I don't think Mr. Kowalski will be amused. Mr. Kowalski is too busy making a pig of himself to think of anything else. Your face and your fingers are disgustingly greasy. Go wash up and then help me clear the table.
Now, that's how I'm going to clear the table. Don't you ever talk that way to me. Pig, Polak, disgusting, vulgar, greasy. Those kind of words have been on your tongue, and your sister's tongue is too much around here. What do you think you are, a pair of queens? Just remember what Huey Long said, that every man's a king, and I'm the king around here. And don't you forget it. My place is all cleared up now. You want me to clear yours?
So in the late 50s and especially in the 60s, actors who wanted to take part in that kind of authentic performance style often gravitated to New York to study with Adler or Meisner or Strasberg, and to study at the Actors Studio and to learn this method, this technique for accessing a kind of authenticity. And just a few of the actors from New Hollywood who spend at least some time studying the method: Jane Fonda, Ellen Burstyn, Faye Dunaway, Robert De Niro, Gene Hackman, Al Pacino, Dustin Hoffman, and so many more. And so when they were preparing to bring their craft to the screen, they had spent several years studying the method. When you watch Bonnie and Clyde, Faye Dunaway, Gene Hackman, Warren Beatty, all studied the method. When you watch The Graduate, Dustin Hoffman studied the method. And then Dennis Hopper studied the method. Peter Fonda studied the method. Bruce Dern studied the method. Jon Voight studied the method. Meryl Streep studied the method. Diane Keaton studied the method. This is a list of the sort of who's who of 70s cinema. And so when we think about what New Hollywood was trying to do, and I talked about this with The Cruise, and I talked about this in some of the other videos, was to put on a new kind of realism, a new kind of down and dirty and gritty authenticity. Part of the reason it was able to do that so successfully was because this new generation of performers trained in the method, trained in conveying their emotions, their psychology, their bodily behavior in this method, exploded onto the screens of American cinemas in the late 60s and throughout the 70s. Today, a lot of people seem to think that method acting is full immersion into the character. You get stories about people like Daniel Day-Lewis or Christian Bale who enter character at the beginning of a production and stay in character throughout the production. Sometimes they want to be called their character's name, you know, even when they're in craft services. Sometimes they treat their performers, their co-stars, off screen as they would on screen, so they can embody this character fully. That's an extreme form of the kind of behavioral and emotional approach to the method. But that's a sliver of method acting. And you could look at a spectrum, right? So yeah, Robert De Niro gained a lot of weight for Raging Bull, but he's not always in character as Jake LaMotta. So he puts his body through a physical change as part of his dedication to his craft, but he's able to go in and out of character. Some method actors don't need to gain all the weight. For some method actors, prosthetics are enough. It's still about that accessing the emotion, the psychology, and the behavior so that they can convincingly portray the character's thoughts and feelings and actions on screen. So when we say something like, oh, Daniel Day-Lewis is a method actor, yep, he is, but he's one type of method actor. And that's not the same type of method actor as Denzel Washington or Jane Fonda. Another thing that started to occur in the late 60s is you started to see more ethnic actors on Hollywood screens, but in starring roles. There had always been sort of Italians and Latin, Hispanic performers on Hollywood screens, but they often played stereotypical roles as sort of the heavy or gangsters, or Asian Americans would often play sort of servants or shopkeepers. And slowly throughout the 60s and 70s, these performers started to appear more. Now, it wasn't a massive flowering for all the ethnic and racial groups in America, but it was the beginning of a slow development. So if you look at a film like The Graduate, in the novel of The Graduate, Benjamin is 6 feet tall and blonde and blue-eyed and incredibly handsome. And when Mike Nichols came to cast the film, he's like, that, I don't want that. I want something else. And it's a long story. You can go look it up, but he landed on Dustin Hoffman, and Dustin Hoffman read it. He's like, this isn't me. This is Robert Redford. And Nichols' response was, if I cast Redford in this picture, nobody's going to believe that he'd have a hard time getting the girl. They might believe that with you. I don't know if that's a compliment, but it worked. And there, all of a sudden, you have what's Dustin Hoffman is 5'4", he's Jewish, he has dark hair, he's a little guy, he's got this nasal voice, and it exploded. And there was the sense that we don't need to have Cary Grant play every role. We don't need to have Rock Hudson play every role. We don't even need to have Redford play every role. We can have Dustin Hoffman, Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Gene Hackman. So it wasn't just the appearance of more ethnic actors, but actors, especially men, but some women as well, who were sort of less conventionally attractive in a Hollywood sense, if you know what I mean. Again, it was that drive for a kind of realism. And so as these actors started to appear on screen, the idea of Hollywood glamour started to change for a while in the 70s. And so you had actors, and they're still beautiful, they're still Hollywood performers, but Karen Black and Ellen Burstyn and Eileen Brennan and others started to appear on screen, and they're all great, but they're less conventionally sort of sculptedly beautiful than Doris Day or Janet Leigh or the performers of the 50s and into the 60s. And that also, along with the method acting, and a lot of these actors had studied it, lent this kind of authenticity to American films at the time. Now, it was still very difficult in the 70s for Asian Americans to break out of the stereotypical roles that they were granted. And this was the institutional racism in Hollywood. It's still there. Oscar's so white, and so on. There's chinks in that sort of the institutional defensiveness around kind of white privilege in Hollywood. You know, we make chinks in that every year, but it's still there. But in the 70s, it was still there. So when I say there was a kind of growth of ethnic actors, we're really sort of talking about Italian American, Jewish American, lighter skinned, white-ish performers. Black actors did start to make headway in getting performances, and you had like Richard Roundtree, Lou Gossett Jr., Pam Grier. Oftentimes, not always, they were in non-studio films that still had wide appeal, but the studio system, it took its time, definitely. And so this was the slow development of a more sort of, let's say, enlightened Hollywood. But it did begin with putting somebody like Dustin Hoffman or Al Pacino in starring roles and saying, these guys can do it too. It doesn't have to be conventionally sort of 6-foot, white, waspy, you know, performers. And that's an important historical development, even if at the time it wasn't as widespread or as equal opportunity as it could have been or should have been. There's a lot more we could say about performance in the 70s, but there's just one more thing I want to land on, and it's kind of the combination of the method with this widening that I was talking about. And that's a new experience that these actors were bringing. And one of the things we mean, or that Hollywood actors mean, actors of color mean, when they talk about diversity and inclusivity behind the camera and in front of the camera, is that people from different backgrounds will bring different experiences to the process, not just to the film. It's not just a question of, oh, look, there are X number of women or African Americans or Asian Americans in this film. That is important on its face, but it's the experience that performers with a wide variety of backgrounds bring to the production, to the process of making the film. And the method brought that as well, because what the method does is it encourages performers to think about their role, to ask questions about it. And so you have these kind of commingling but different experiences of questioning the character. So if you have a Hollywood tradition of black characters being written by and directed by white men, which you did for most of Hollywood history, when black actors come into that experience and say, wait a second, man, this is inauthentic. This is not how my character would talk or behave or what he would do. And the same for Asian Americans and the same for foreign performers as well. They're contributing to the process, and they're contributing to that quest for a kind of authenticity. And the method training is doing that too. So even if you're, let's say, Faye Dunaway or Jane Fonda, you're going to ask, like, why am I saying this? Why am I as in my character, doing this? Some directors are receptive to that. Some directors are less receptive to that. And Hollywood as an institution has taken a long time to be receptive to that. I mean, Hollywood treats directors like they're the sort of king of the hill, and writers, even though they often feel disrespected, they're up there too. So there's a sense that a lot of directors have had throughout Hollywood history that, who are you, actor, to question my directing? It's in the script, do it. But we see throughout Hollywood history, even in the 70s and so on, that some actors are more open to that. So the scene I showed at the beginning of Luke, John Voight, in his wheelchair, talking to those high school kids, they filmed that scene a few times, and each time Voight delivered it differently. He changed the dialogue. He drew on his own experiences. And a director like Hal Ashby would say, yeah, let's do it. It works. A director like Stanley Kubrick, who was more in control of the way he wanted his film to look and the dialogue he wanted his actors to perform, would be less receptive to that. Robert Altman was quite receptive to that. John Cassavetes was a little less receptive to that, although he favored improvisation during rehearsal in a lot of ways. But the point is that as the method came into Hollywood, and as actors with different, various, diverse backgrounds started to come into Hollywood, they brought a thoughtfulness to the performance that was also different. And I don't mean to say that Cary Grant wasn't thoughtful, or Humphrey Bogart wasn't thoughtful, or Katharine Hepburn wasn't thoughtful, or Doris Day wasn't thoughtful. But it's a different kind of thoughtfulness. And you hear the stories about De Niro, for example, going through his scripts and making suggested changes, noting like how he believes, based on his understanding of Travis Bickle's psychiatry and psychology, that he would do this. And Scorsese being very sort of collaborative with De Niro, saying, okay, let's try it. Let's see how it works. Right? That's the thoughtfulness that the method encouraged. And so what you got throughout the 1970s was a huge stable of performers who brought a completely different approach to acting, where it was more about embodying the character than performing the character. Now, there are huge debates about the sort of efficacy of method acting, and there's a completely different tradition in British acting based on stage training, based on training the body to articulate gestures and emotions in a different way. And you get famous stories like Dustin Hoffman staying up all night on The Marathon Man because his character stayed up all night on The Marathon Man so he could appear tired and exhausted. and Laurence Olivier, British trained stage actor who had very little time for the method, saying, have you ever tried acting? And I don't want to say that one is better than the other. The point here is really to say that the method was incredibly influential on Hollywood films, Hollywood filmmaking, Hollywood screen presence in the 1970s. It still is today, in different ways, I think, because there's a new kind of commercialism in Hollywood that sort of favors youth and beauty sometimes over talent, although there are great and talented method actors still working in Hollywood today, of course. The thing about the 70s that's noticeable is that it seemed to pervade the industry. And that's part of what makes those films so exciting. That's all for now, everybody. Thanks for watching. If you've watched up to here, hit the like button, man. And as I say, if you've been watching a few of my videos, I'd be happy if you'd hit the subscribe button as well, share them with your friends, and drop a comment. Let me know what you think. I've been getting a few more comments over the last few weeks, which is good because it lets me know that these kinds of videos and my What Makes This Film Great videos are getting out there and reaching an audience. And I'd love to know what you think. Do you have any favorite actors from the 70s? Do you have any opinions, pro or con, about method acting? Do you disagree with anything I said, or does anything I said need sort of some details filled in? Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. In the meantime, I'm Aaron Hunter. Keep watching movies.